Years ago, in one of my father's churches, a young woman came to discuss something with him. She liked the church. She believed in God. She wanted to worship and live the way God called her to live. Every Sunday, the church prayed the Lord's Prayer. And her father had abused her so terribly that saying or even hearing those words, "Our Father," awakened what we would now call PTSD. At the time, she only knew how terrible those words made her feel. Not everyone has a good father to celebrate on Father's Day. Those of us who do or did have one are grateful. For those who don't, I hope that day wasn't too painful. Everyone responds differently because their experiences and personalities are individual. I had a good friend in graduate school who had an abusive father who finally committed suicide when she was 5 or maybe 6. Her mother remarried, and it turned out her stepfather wasn't a prize either. But in this case, my friend said it comforted her to think of God as the kind of father who is as all fathers should be. Now, Jesus had obviously known a good father in Joseph the carpenter. He called God a father as easily as a child runs to a loving daddy with a scraped knee. You've heard it before that the actual translation of Our Father would be closer to Daddy or Papa. I don't think Jesus would condemn the first woman at all for her psychological struggle. There are Christians today who make words or titles or doctrines into gatekeeping affairs, but not Jesus. He would love this young woman and help her find images to use for God that did not inspire terror or pain. Now, what does that have to do with James and his words about anger, aside from the fact that people often take out their anger on the most helpless or vulnerable victim available, like a child? Well, today, in memory of my father, whom I lost many years ago, I wanted to use an excerpt from one of his sermons. Dad didn't have very many manuscripts, but he did do extensive outlines, which I have many of in my collection of sentimental stuff from him. And by the way, I may do that again sometime because I don't think his legacy should be forgotten. But anyway, I was looking at a sermon he wrote years ago in preparation for retirement. His last church was wonderful, but it had multiple problems when we arrived. I was too young at the time to realize, but people were angry at the Methodist Church because of what some Methodists in the denominations had said. Dad wrote this: "Many of these people were ready and willing to take out their irritation on anyone available." It reminded me of something my father did when I was 3 or 4 years of age. A family of friends had come to visit our home. The children were incorrigible, tearing up the place, and their parents did nothing to stop them. My father whipped me, although I was not responsible for anything that was going on. I am sure my father soon forgot the incident, but I have remembered it well. I loved my father, and I do now, but I was hurt inwardly as well as outwardly. It took many years for me to understand that my father whipped me because he could not punish the guilty people. That childhood experience, my father said, and I quote, was a preparation for the ministry. I soon found that people had more problems than they could handle. They could not get to the source of their trouble. They have taken out their wrath on the wrong thing or person. The only thing I would have added is that I don't think it's ever right to take out our wrath on a person, period. But anyhow, when I read those words my father had written, they seemed as apt then as they should have seemed when I was a teenager. We live in an angry world right now. I see it in news reports, in tweets, and Facebook posts, and in social commentary. We live in a world where people take out their anger on the nearest target or the most vulnerable target, or where they won't be opposed, or where they think people will not fight back. Sometimes they find out differently, but that's their goal, and people do it without even thinking. It reminded me of a story that I read years ago. I was doing research at the university for several months on sabbatical to find stories for use. If you're not familiar with them, Anansi stories are from Africa originally. I think they got translated into the United States as the Brer Rabbit stories. But they tell sometimes about a spider and sometimes a man named Anansi. In this one, Anansi was a man, and he grew elderly and somewhat infirm. Two nice young fellows wanted to help him out, so they came and aided him in his farming. But then he went blind and he couldn't farm at all. The young men still wanted to help him as much as possible, to be as self-sufficient and do things for himself, so they took him fishing every day. They would say, this is where you step in the boat, this is a good place to let down your net, pull up the net here, we're at the shore, this is where you step out. And at first Anansi was grateful, but then he started getting really abusive. Oh, I knew that already. I'm a much better fisherman than you ever were. I already knew that, you stupid people. Went on day after day like that. And then one day they took him out and did the same. And at the end of fishing, he said, well, we're at the shore now. This is where you step out. I already knew that, you stupid people. You're such idiots. He stepped out in the middle of the lake, and they rowed away. This story really bugged me. I was doing research all day at the university. I was scanning hundreds of stories, and yet this one stayed with me despite all those other stories. I thought, well, I could use it for gratitude, but there are much nicer stories to talk about gratitude. But it stayed, and I couldn't sleep that night, 3 or 4 in the morning, and I still couldn't sleep because I'm thinking about this story. And I suddenly realized why. This is a story about the frustrations of getting older or being disabled or being unable to do the things that we feel like we should. It's a story about taking that frustration out in the nearest possible person, sometimes the family or person who's doing their best to help us. And that person becomes a symbol of their problem. It isn't logical. It's completely counterproductive. And caregivers get frustrated too, as the story illustrates, so they don't always react well. The expression of anger in our society needs to be examined. Now, obviously, from the words of James and other people in the Bible, this was a problem thousands of years ago as well. For example, the book of Proverbs says a lot about anger. One thing it tells us is that fools give vent to their wrath, but the wise bring calm in the end. Or do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with someone who is easily angered. Psalms tells us, refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It only leads to evil. Last week's story about David was about 2 men with quick tempers and how David was restrained by Abigail's wisdom from overreacting and being even worse than the person who was rude in the first place. Now, we often interpret the teaching of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth as being a harsh and unkind law. But for its time, it was exceptionally compassionate. What would happen is someone would do something, sometimes even by accident, and the injured person and or their family might go wipe out everyone in that other person's family, or maybe even their whole clan. The eye for an eye law said you can't let loose with unrestrained anger. You cannot do more than you receive, period. You cannot harm innocent people because you are angry. Now, we could talk about the epidemic shootings across our country in relation to this, but the thing is, anger is expressed in many little ways, and I'm more interested in how we do this in our interpersonal lives. We could all be vulnerable to the inappropriate expression of anger. It's hard to restrain grumpiness at the delivery person or the cashier or the clerk at the post office. I remember a time when a salesperson at a large store had been particularly helpful, and I asked to see the manager. When he approached me, it was with a look of absolute dread on his face, and I suddenly realized why, because all he ever got were complaints. No one bothered to share the compliments, and his expression changed remarkably when I explained how I wanted to compliment the salesman and how helpful he had been to me. Now, I do not think I was uniquely fortunate in finding a good person to work with, but most people are anxious to say something negative and forget to say something good. It's so easy also for us to take out our frustration or anger on some little thing that an innocent person did, and then they get the load of everything that's going on in our lives. We are wise to take a deep breath, process our anger, and not turn it on others around us. I can't say I've always been good at this, but my hope would be to use the energy of anger and then funnel it into something positive. James's advice is good. We should be quick to listen. We should be slow to speak. We should be slow to become angry. I would add, if we cannot stop from being angry, we should be exceptionally careful. Remember always that anyone who receives that anger is God's child. And Jesus has made it clear that whatever we do to someone else is the same as doing it to him. Amen.